Enter the cabin of Flight 172. This confined little space hummed with the usual pre-takeoff chaos. Overhead bins clattered shut as passengers fought for space to shove their little bags filled with a bit of their worlds. A harried father dragged his toddler down the aisle, murmuring something that sounded suspiciously like a bribe. The distinct smell of stale coffee mixed with a faint tang of disinfectant. Somewhere near the middle of the plane, a baby decided it'd be the best time to unleash an ear-splitting wail. The last one sure got a whole chorus of sighs from already tired passengers. Amid the busy flight life, Margaret sat at seat 12B, her head bowed and hands clasped tightly. She seems to be a pious one, doesn't she? She had boarded early as usual, keen to avoid the jostling and noise. She wasn't particularly afraid of flying, but prayer before takeoff was something she would never miss. A grounding act in a chaotic world. Her lips moved ever so slowly, her grey hair tucked neatly behind her ears. Margaret's cardigan was a faded pink, the kind of sweater that you'd see she's been taken care of for decades. There was indeed something divine about this woman and the way she carried herself. As Margaret finished her whispered prayer, Natalie appeared at the edge of her vision. With her sleek ponytail, a perfectly pressed uniform, and a smile that somehow managed to look both welcoming and forced, Natalie sure knew how to represent corporate hospitality. Almost felt like she was born for the job. Also, hey, if you like what you see, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating tales from the skies. She moved with practiced efficiency, and you'd never find her heels clicking loudly in a way that annoyed you. Well, we could also thank the plane's carpeted floor for that. Her job wasn't glamorous and she knew it, but she had long since learned to wear sarcasm with her beauty-like armor. Because how else was she to survive the horrors of being a flight attendant? "Ma'am," Natalie said, leaning closer. "Is everything all right?" Her voice was warm, but there was an unmistakable edge, a faint touch of mocking that hung in the air, something like a bad aftertaste. Margaret looked up, startled but polite. "Oh, yes, I was just saying a prayer before we take off." Natalie blinked, and for a second something flickered across her face, a mix of amusement and incredulity. Then she smiled a thin, sharp smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, which looked a little more forced than the last one. Right, because planes really benefit from divine intervention, don't they? Now, she may have spoken those words casually, but her unnecessary rudeness got the nearby passengers turning their heads, with their curiosity piqued. In seat 13A, Adam, a businessman, a guy with the weary look of someone who'd spent more time in airports than at home, glanced up from his phone. Across the aisle, Zara, a teenager with oversized headphones resting around her neck, paused mid-scribble in her diary. Even the wailing baby seemed momentarily subdued, as though the time itself had stopped to listen. Margaret's smile didn't waver. "It's just my way of finding peace," she said softly, folding her hands in her lap. Natalie straightened, her smirk widening. "Well, as long as you don't pray for turbulence," she said, chuckling under her breath. Seriously though, Natalie sounded like her relationship with God had some issues. The joke landed poorly. A ripple of discomfort moved through the cabin. Adam frowned, setting his phone down. Sophia, a young mother cradling her baby 2 rows behind Margaret, whispered something soothing to her child, her eyes darting nervously between the older woman and the flight attendant. Margaret said nothing. It's impressive how her expression remained so calm and unbothered. She had faced her share of ridicule over the years for being the way she was. Faith, she had learned, often made people uncomfortable for no reason whatsoever. Adam cleared his throat. "Don't you have a safety briefing to deliver?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Though Margaret may be forgiving, Adam sure didn't like the unprofessional tone Natalie had the whole time. Natalie's composure faltered. "Of course," she said quickly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her cheeks flushed slightly as she turned and walked briskly to the front of the plane. Margaret resumed her prayer. Even the momentary disturbance was not enough to shake her focus. But the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Zara scribbled furiously in her diary. The flight attendant just mocked the praying lady. Everyone saw. Vibes equals awkward. She tapped her pen against the paper, her teenage mind already at creating the incident into a dramatic retelling for her blog. Wouldn't hurt to add a little spice for a few more likes now, wouldn't it? Meanwhile, Sophia adjusted her baby's blanket and muttered under her breath, "People should mind their own business." Looks like no one was having Natalie's attitude. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, temporarily breaking the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be taking off shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." The plane lurched slightly as it began to taxi down the runway. Natalie passed Margaret again on her way to the jump seat, her face carefully neutral. But as she walked by, a small, unmistakable smirk played on her lips, which said she was still not done with Margaret's fake behavior. Margaret, on the other hand, didn't even seem to notice, or perhaps she chose not to. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, her eyes closed and her hands resting calmly on her lap. The plane accelerated, the roar of the engines drowning out the last whispers of the cabin. As the wheels lifted off the ground, Zara scribbled another note. The lady in 12B didn't even flinch during takeoff. Total zen. Respect. We've got to admit that part of the story Zara sure got right. Adam, now scrolling through emails, paused to glance at Margaret. There was something about her serenity that unsettled him too, though he couldn't quite say why. Sophia, still nervous, clutched her baby a little tighter but found herself watching Margaret too, as though hoping the older woman's composure might somehow be contagious. Natalie, seated at the front, allowed herself a glance back at Margaret. She couldn't explain why, but the sight of the older woman sitting there, unshaken and resolute, annoyed her. She turned away, shaking her head, trying to convince herself it wasn't her problem. But the cabin hadn't forgotten. Low murmurs spread among the passengers, fragments of disapproval aimed at Natalie's earlier remarks. Adam exchanged a knowing look with Sophia, and even Zara, usually glued to her music, kept her earbuds out in case there was any drama she'd miss. Margaret, for her part, remained still and unbothered by the quiet storm she had stirred, or perhaps she was simply above it. As the plane climbed higher, the tension in the cabin still lingered. You could say what began as a simple prayer had sparked a chain reaction, setting the stage for something far greater. The plane settled into a steady cruise way up at 35,000 feet. Natalie moved down the aisle with the practiced grace of so many years, her tray of beverages clinking softly as she handed out cups of orange juice and soda. Despite her outward calm, her earlier interaction with Margaret was still at the edge of her thoughts, nagging like an itch she couldn't scratch. Row 12 was quiet, but not in the peaceful way Natalie had hoped. Adam sat rigidly, his arms crossed as if challenging the universe to hand him another inconvenience. He's a true example of a frustrated being. Across from him, Sophia juggled her fussy baby, the infant's cries coming in small bursts now like distant thunder. Probably one of the reasons Adam was frustrated. Zara was still scribbling in her diary, occasionally glancing at Margaret, who sat in quiet contemplation, her gaze fixed out of the window. It was Adam who broke the silence first, leaning slightly towards Margaret. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but distinct. He couldn't contain it anymore. "Did you mean to just let her get away with that?" Margaret turned, her expression calm but curious. "Get away with what?" Adam gave a small sigh and gestured vaguely toward the front of the plane. "The way she mocked you. I mean, I'm not exactly religious, but don't you think that was out of line?" Margaret's smile was gentle, almost amused. "Oh, I've learned to pick my battles. Besides, she's young. Perhaps she doesn't know better. Not the first time I've dealt with this kind." Adam raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by Margaret's diplomacy. "Sure, but people like that don't learn unless someone calls them out. You shouldn't let people talk to you like that." From across the aisle, Sophia chimed in, her voice tired but firm. "She's right though. It's not worth it. I mean, what do you even say to someone like that? Hey, maybe don't mock people for having faith. Not exactly a hallmark moment either, so..." Adam shrugged, but his jaw tightened. "Still, it's the principle." Natalie, now 2 rows behind, caught snippets of their conversation. Her ears burned when she realized all the murmuring was about her. She pressed her lips together and moved on, handing out a cup of water to an elderly man who didn't even look up to thank her. But then again, she did bring this on herself. By now, whispers had started circulating. Zara's diary had turned into a whole live commentary, each page filled with hastily scrawled notes. The business guy's annoyed. Mom is tired. Praying lady is just chilling. The flight attendant looks pretty mad now. Meanwhile, turbulence began to set in a little bit more. Not the bone-rattling kind, but enough to make drinks ripple in their cups and passengers grip their armrests a little tighter and even be reminded of God. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a bit of rough air. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Margaret's calm demeanor remained unchanged, but the rest of the cabin wasn't as composed. Sophia cradled her baby tightly, whispering soothing words. Adam muttered under his breath something about how turbulence always seems to hit during beverage service. Even Zara, who had been writing furiously, set her pen down to grip the edges of her tray table. Natalie, now at the front of the plane, braced herself against the galley counter. She hated turbulence, not because she feared it, but because it always made her job harder. Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a faint unease she couldn't quite shake. The plane jolted suddenly, harder this time, eliciting gasps and a few stifled shrieks. Margaret closed her eyes, her lips moving silently again. Across the aisle, Adam watched her, his brow furrowed. "She's praying again," he whispered to himself. Sophia noticed too. "Honestly," she said to Adam, "I wouldn't mind a little divine intervention right now." The two of them chuckled together. Natalie overheard this as she walked past, her tray now empty. She couldn't help herself. "Don't worry," she said with a tight smile. "The plane's built to handle turbulence, not prayers." The remark landed like a thud. Adam's face darkened and even Sophia gave her a sharp stare. Zara, now emboldened, whispered just loud enough for Natalie to hear. "You know, mocking people doesn't exactly inspire confidence." Natalie stopped, her grip tightening on the tray. "I'm not mocking anyone, I'm just saying." "You're just saying something you should keep to yourself, Adam interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but the weight behind it made heads turn. Margaret, sensing the tension rising, spoke softly. "It's all right. Let's not turn this into something bigger than it has to be." But the passengers were no longer interested in letting it slide. Adam leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed. "You might want to think about how people talk to you," he said pointedly. Natalie's was totally red with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to respond but was cut off by another sharp jolt of turbulence. The plane dipped slightly, and this time the baby started crying all over again, its cries piercing through the tension like a siren. The captain's voice returned, calm but a little more serious than the last time. "We're experiencing heavier turbulence than expected. Cabin crew, please take your seats." Natalie retreated to her seat immediately, her face a mask of frustration. The whispers behind her didn't stop. Zara went back to scribbling in her diary. The flight attendant got called out. The business guy is kind of a hero, not gonna lie. Turbulence equals scary. As the plane rocked, Margaret remained still, her eyes closed and her hands resting calmly in her lap. Adam glanced at her again, this time with something closer to respect. Sophia clutched her baby, whispered, "Whatever she's praying for, I really hope it works." In front, Natalie sat with her hands clenched in her lap. She stared straight ahead, the weight of judgment pressing down on her almost as much as the turbulence shaking the plane. Thankfully for the passengers, the turbulence subsided 20 minutes later, leaving the cabin steeped in an uneasy calm. Passengers gradually loosened their grips on the armrests and exchanged some confused glances with each other. Even the baby had stopped crying, pacified by a lull of exhaustion and the rhythmic vibration of the engines. Natalie, though, remained strapped into a jump seat, her eyes fixed on the overhead compartments. It was almost as if she wanted the flight to end. She was low-key aware of the tension building among the passengers, and it gnawed at her nerves. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, entitled travelers, cranky kids, the occasional drunk, but never this, a collective coldness. But the reaction was much deserved, and it was about time that she was made to realize. Margaret, however, seemed completely oblivious to the friction her prayer had caused. Neither was she worried about anything that happened with turbulence. As the flight attendants were cleared to continue their duties, she unfolded her hands and reached for her carry-on beneath the seat. From it, she pulled out a small journal, its cover worn smooth from years of use. Zara took note of it immediately. The teenager leaned forward, as nosy as ever. "What are you writing?" she asked, her voice soft but audible enough to reach nearby rows. Margaret looked up, not too surprised, but she wasn't annoyed either. "Oh, just some thoughts. Nothing very interesting, my dear." Zara's curiosity deepened. "Like prayers?" Margaret hesitated, then smiled. "Sometimes. And sometimes just a little summary of the day. A little gratitude goes a long way now, doesn't it?" The simple statement caught Adam's attention. He glanced over, pretending not to eavesdrop. Sophia, who had finally coaxed her baby to sleep, also listened intently. Natalie, passing nearby, caught the exchange and couldn't resist interjecting. "Gratitude, huh? Is that before or after you pray for turbulence to stop?" Another sarcastic comment that landed awkwardly, met with a few scattered groans from passengers who had clearly grown weary of her remarks. Adam, no longer content to let Natalie's barbs slide, turned to her. "You know, if you spent less time mocking people and more time handing out peanuts, this flight might be a little more tolerable." The passenger started to wonder how she still had her job with this attitude. Was she always like this, or was it just today? Laughter rippled through the cabin, but Natalie didn't join in. Her expression was more serious than ever, and for a moment it seemed she might retort. Instead, she turned on her heel and trotted towards the galley, her posture stiff. Margaret sighed, tucking her journal away. "I don't mean to cause trouble," she said quietly, addressing Adam and Zara. "You didn't?" Adam replied quickly, making sure that she didn't blame herself for any of this. She did. Zara nodded, her voice unusually loud this time. "Yeah, it's not like you did anything wrong. She's just being mean." Sophia was in on this too, her tone softer. "It's not about you. Some people just don't know how to handle seeing someone else's peace." Looks like Margaret had the whole plane on her side without even having to try, while all Natalie was getting was rude comebacks for her obnoxious statements. Margaret now glanced across the small cluster of passengers, now speaking in her defense. She seemed genuinely touched, though she quickly switched topics. "Well, we're all here together, aren't we? Let's make the best of it." Adam leaned back, relaxing slightly for the first time since takeoff. Zara returned to her diary but added a note of admiration for Margaret's calm demeanor. Even Sophia, whose nerves had been triggered by the turbulence, seemed to find comfort in Margaret's calmness. In the galley, Natalie began to fume. She rummaged through snack trays and drink carts with more aggressiveness than necessary. Her mind kept taking her back to Adam's comment. She wasn't used to passengers turning on her. Usually, she was the one in control, smiling, efficient, untouchable, but now she felt exposed and cornered in a way that made her skin crawl. "Everything okay?" her colleague Claire asked. Natalie hesitated, then forced a smile. "Fine, just passengers being passengers." Claire raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. She knew Natalie well enough to sense when her colleague needed space. "Let me know if you need a break," she offered before stepping back into the cabin. Natalie stayed behind. She couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret had somehow turned the entire plane against her without lifting a finger. It wasn't fair. She was just doing her job, wasn't she? Meanwhile, back in row 12, Margaret had struck up a quiet conversation with Zara. The teenager asked questions about faith and prayer, her tone curious rather than judgmental. Sophia, inspired by the conversation, spoke up. "You know, I used to pray before flights too. I haven't done it in years though. Got too busy with life, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit it added a good amount of peace to my life." Margaret smiled warmly. "It's never too late to start again. Faith isn't about being perfect, it's about showing up. We're not perfect in ourselves, we're perfect through faith." The exchange left an impact, visible in the thoughtful expressions of those nearby. Even Zara, usually lost in her own world, seemed more reflective as she returned to her diary, jotting down Margaret's words like a quote she'd remember at some point in her life. By now, the mood in the cabin had lightened. What had begun as a tense and divisive atmosphere was softening, replaced by a more calm discussion. Passengers began to exchange smiles instead of frowns, and a sense of quiet camaraderie began to take root. Natalie, emerging from the galley, noticed the change immediately. She saw the passengers laughing quietly, leaning into conversations that seemed to flow without much tension. What's funny is the calmness that surrounded her irritated her even more. Peculiar woman she is indeed. What she couldn't stand was Margaret getting all that attention, the kind Natalie would usually have for herself with her polished professionalism. The plane's intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for a smooth descent into Denver. Please fasten your seatbelts as we begin our approach. As the plane started to descend slowly, Natalie resolved to reassert control. She adjusted her uniform and strode back into the cabin with a confident expression, ready to reclaim authority as if she hadn't just caused everyone to get irritated. But what awaited her was something she hadn't anticipated. As the plane began to descend through the glowing evening sky, a quiet anticipation settled over the cabin. Passengers leaned back in their seats, some of them lost in the beauty of the golden clouds, others flipping through whatever was left of the in-flight magazines with half-hearted interest. For most, the journey was nearing its end, but Natalie was still consumed with jealousy. She walked down the aisle, performing her usual final safety checks, her forced smile back in place, but faltering at the edges. She avoided Margaret's gaze as she passed row 12, but the cluster of passengers there, Margaret, Adam, Zara, Sophia, seemed closer now. They didn't do anything to gang up against Natalie, but for some reason, she couldn't stand it. Natalie stopped by a woman in row 15 who struggled to secure her tray table. As she assisted, a voice called out from the back, "Excuse me, can I get a refill of water?" It was an older man, his tone more impatient than polite. "I'll be with you shortly," Natalie replied, though her voice colder than usual. As she returned to the galley, she felt the weight of several pairs of eyes on her. The whispering had started again. "I don't get it," Zara whispered to Adam. "Why is she still acting like that? It's like she can't just let things go." Adam shook his head. "Some people just don't like being wrong. She's probably just embarrassed. She did cause a wholly unnecessary scene. Who knows, maybe she's reflecting on it?" Margaret, ever calm, interjected gently. "We all carry our own struggles. Perhaps this is hers." Zara tilted her head. "That's a nice way to look at it, but I don't think she deserves that much benefit of the doubt." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she knew something others didn't. "It's not about what she deserves. It's about how we choose to respond." Their conversation was interrupted by the captain's voice. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Natalie strapped herself into a jump seat at the front of the plane, her mind racing. She could feel the stares from row 12, their quiet judgment cutting deeper than she cared to admit. As the plane taxied to the gate, Natalie stood and prepared to give the usual landing announcement, but as she reached for the intercom, she hesitated. Her hand lingered over the button, her polished script suddenly feeling hollow. She glanced down the aisle and saw Margaret looking at her, not with judgment, but with a quiet kindness and warmth of some sort. When the plane came to a stop, the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began gathering their stuff. Natalie moved to assist, her demeanor softer now, though her nerves remained frayed. Margaret, unhurried, waited for her turn to stand. When Natalie approached her row, Margaret looked up with a gentle smile. "Thank you for your hard work," Margaret said. Her tone was warm, genuine, and not sarcastic one bit. Natalie blinked, caught off guard. For a moment she didn't know how to respond. "Oh, you're welcome," she stammered, her embarrassment getting the best of her this time. Margaret stood, smoothing her cardigan. "I know it's not an easy job," she continued, her voice low enough that only Natalie could hear. "You do it well, even when it's hard, regardless of what happened today." The words hit Natalie like a sudden gust of wind, catching her off balance. She opened her mouth to reply, but found herself at a loss for words. Adam, who'd been watching, stepped forward, his suitcase in hand. "Take care, ma'am," he said to Margaret, giving her a respectful nod. He glanced at Natalie, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. "And you too, try not to get into trouble, yeah?" he added. Sophia followed with her baby, offering a quiet smile to Natalie. Even Zara, usually reserved, paused to say, "Thanks for the flight," before disappearing down the aisle. As the last of the passengers disembarked, Natalie stood in the doorway, watching them file into the terminal. Her shoulders felt heavier than usual, but not in the way she expected. She glanced back at the now empty cabin, the echoes of whispered judgments fading into the hum of the plane's idle engines. In the galley, Claire approached her, her brow furrowed in concern. "You okay?" Natalie nodded slowly, though her expression was distant. "Yeah," she said after a moment, "just thinking." Claire tilted her head. "About?" Natalie hesitated, then sighed. "About how I've been acting. Maybe I didn't handle things the way I should have." Claire smiled faintly, giving Natalie a pat on the shoulder. "We all have bad days. The important thing is what you do next." As the crew prepared for the next flight, Natalie couldn't shake the image of Margaret's serene smile. It stayed with her, a quiet reminder that grace and kindness could disarm even the sharpest edges. And somewhere in the airport, Zara typed furiously into her blog, recounting the day's events with the dramatic flair only a teenager could muster. Faith isn't about being loud. Sometimes it's about staying calm while the world spins around you. Margaret in 12B taught me that today. So the whole time when Natalie thought the bunch of them had grouped against her, Margaret in 12B taught them how to be kind, even if the other person didn't deserve it. Takes a different level of maturity to think like that now, doesn't it?
Did you enjoy this story of grace and redemption in the skies? If so, don't forget to like, share, and then check out our tale of racist soldier destroys a church and faces divine wrath. Stay tuned for more.